Now that the formality of the Pennsylvania primary is behind us, we can now turn our focus towards the general election. Now, it really was just a formality because Dave McCormick on the Republican side was running unopposed, and obviously Bob Casey as an incumbent was unopposed, so there really were no competitive primaries on either side. And this is a huge stark contrast to 2022, where we had an extremely divisive primary on the Republican side, which resulted in the base being very fractured going into the general election. So this time around, Republicans are playing their cards right, and Dave McCormick is certainly going to shape up, I think, to be a pretty formidable challenger to Bob Casey. It's certainly going to be his tightest election yet. So we're going to take a look more in depth at the Pennsylvania Senate race, talk about Dave McCormick as a candidate, and why I think he'll pose a significant challenge to Bob Casey. And then, of course, we're going to talk about where this race is likely to end up in November with Donald Trump on the ballot. So we're going to get to all of that in just a second. But first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. Now, this is certainly going to be an uphill battle for the Republicans. Bob Casey is a three-term incumbent at this point. He's well known in Pennsylvania. His father was a very popular governor of the state, and the Casey last name is widely known in the state of Pennsylvania. Now, I think what makes this different than the last time Bob Casey ran back in 2018 is that this is now a presidential election in a more polarized climate. Donald Trump is going to be on the ballot. And with that, you're going to see a higher turnout from his typical demographic of supporters, white working class voters in the rural parts of the state. Of course, that poses a problem for Bob Casey because even though he might do better with those voters slightly than the typical Democrat, the vast majority of those voters are going to end up voting for Republican Dave McCormick. So you have that dynamic already making this race a bit more of a challenge. But I think Dave McCormick's biggest strength is his ability to fundraise. He's a very wealthy man, and he's basically been able to match Bob Casey in fundraising, putting a lot of his own money into this election. Now, this was something that Dr. Oz did back in 2022, but I don't think Dave McCormick has the image problem that Dr. Oz has, and McCormick's been blanketing the airwaves in Pennsylvania with ads attacking his opponent and, of course, introducing himself to the state once again. Because the last time Pennsylvania voters had Bob Casey on the ballot, he very narrowly lost to Dr. Oz by less than 1,000 votes. But now Dave McCormick has another strength that Dr. Oz didn't, and I think other Republicans don't have, is that he is from the western part of Pennsylvania. And if we take a look at the primary results, this was his best area of the state by far, especially Allegheny County, Washington being his home county. These other areas of the state where Dr. Oz struggled to do well in back in 2022. If we go back, of course, Dr. Oz underperformed pretty considerably in, for instance, Westmoreland County, a county of over 500,000 people. Dr. Oz only gets 58% of the vote. Donald Trump won this county by almost 30 points back in the 2020 election. Washington County, same thing. This was a county that Donald Trump won by like 25 points. Dr. Oz only wins it by low double digits. So, you know, Dr. Oz struggled to resonate with these white working class, in many cases, ancestrally Democratic voters. And while Dave McCormick is not some sort of factory worker or union boss who's turned Republican appealing to these voters, he's not exactly working class. He is from this area and can sort of tout his working class roots, if you will, from the state. Because in Pennsylvania, obviously, it matters a lot to these voters, which, you know, this is a state that's not very transient, that you're actually from the state. And that also brings up a weakness of Dave McCormick, and that's he spent a lot of his life also in Connecticut. So, you know, it's a little bit different than Dr. Oz. Dr. Oz was mainly from New Jersey, and then, of course, you know, owned property in Montgomery County shortly after the 2020 election. So, and also he's a celebrity doctor, and there was a number of things you could tie Dr. Oz to, which made him a very easy target, and his campaign had really bad footing at the start of the election. It really wasn't until August, September that I think the Oz campaign sort of got its act together, but it was definitely too late, and you had extenuating circumstances like abortion and, of course, the whole Stop the Steal Trump dynamic / Mastriano being on the ballot that I think really dragged him down. So, you know, it would have been hard for any Republican to win in 2022, but I think a lot of the McCormick supporters felt a bit vindicated in their primary choice after the midterms because they thought that Dave McCormick surely could have won that election against John Fetterman. But now he's going up against somebody who definitely is a much stronger opponent because, again, Bob Casey is an entrenched Democrat. He's been in the Senate since 2007, and he's been treasurer before that. So he's been well known in the state for decades now. So Dave McCormick has to compete against that. But this is a race that Republicans are actually planning to put a decent amount of money in. Steve Daines has said multiple times that Pennsylvania is going to be a prime target, as well as Nevada and Wisconsin and other swing states like that. So Pennsylvania is very much going to be competitive this time around. Now, of course, I don't want to be misleading. This is definitely a race that leans towards Bob Casey pretty considerably. It's not a safe race by any means, but, as of right now, if the election were held today, Bob Casey would probably win by high single digits, even with Donald Trump on the ballot. Now, a lot of that can change, of course, over the next few months, and there's certainly things that I think Dave McCormick could do to do better against Bob Casey. I think first and foremost, he needs to completely change how Bob Casey is seen in the state. Calling Bob Casey a nice guy, but not the right guy, I don't think is really the right messaging. You need to absolutely hammer away at his image in the state of Pennsylvania if you want any chance to win, because, Pennsylvanians by default think of him as this working class champion Democratic senator. And of course, with an image like that, it's not surprising to see that in his previous elections, he's done fairly well. Now, back in 2018, Bob Casey really didn't have much of a challenge getting reelected. You had a blue wave year, coupled with the fact he was going up against Lou Barletta, who, interestingly enough, won the Obama-Trump county of Luzerne, which is where he's from, by around 8 points, but ultimately underperformed virtually everywhere else in the state. That's one of the reasons why he lost the 2022 primary for governor. He was really banking on name recognition alone, thinking that voters knew who Barletta was and they'd just vote for him by default, and that was a very dangerous assumption because as a result, we got Mastriano, who ended up losing Pennsylvania by 15 points. And this is a swing state, mind you, that Joe Biden only won by little less than over a point 2 years before that. So, even in 2024, if Biden wins the state of Pennsylvania, it's probably going to be within 4 to 5 points. So it's not inconceivable to think that a Republican could outrun Donald Trump. And I certainly think that Stacey Garrity, the state treasurer, who's a Republican, and Timothy DeFleur, who's the state auditor, they're definitely going to outrun Trump. It's really a question of if they can outrun him enough to win. They're incumbent Republicans, so I think they have a little bit of an advantage. And, places like the Philadelphia collar counties, which tend to be more ancestrally Republican, tend to go more red in those down ballot races than at the top of the ticket. So I think they've all got an easier time than Dave McCormick. Now, I think another strategy the McCormick campaign is going to try that I think Dr. Oz's team might have talked about, I don't know if they really implemented it, but it was really hammering their message home in the suburban parts of the state, because this is the area where Republicans struggle the most. And it was something that Dr. Oz, or at least, many political people like myself had thought that Dr. Oz would utilize, trying to make his image more palatable in the suburbs, because he already has that more moderate vibe to him, so to speak, while Mastriano kind of ran up Republican margins in the rurals. Now, that was very flawed thinking now, obviously looking back in retrospect, but I don't think Dave McCormick and Donald Trump are nearly as toxic in the state of Pennsylvania as Dr. Oz and Doug Mastriano were, especially Doug Mastriano, because he was so extreme for the state. He ended up losing safe Republican counties, places like Beaver County that were, ancestrally Republican, but, Mastriano was so extreme that you even had counties that haven't voted for Democrats in presidential elections in decades going blue in this governor's race. So, McCormick really has to focus on West PA, obviously where he's from, because this is a high population area. The Pittsburgh metro area has millions of people in it, especially places like Westmoreland County, Washington County. These are populous ex-urban counties outside of Pittsburgh that run up big margins for Republicans. So if you can get big turnout in these areas and bigger margins in these areas, you have a real shot of winning. So you have to do well here, places like Erie, but you also need to be able to win places like Bucks County, or at least get very close and sort of narrow up Chester County, places that are safe blue but have large populations, and then run up margins in areas that have large populations already that are Republican. Lancaster County is one place, for example. Perhaps that'll be a separate video, because this is a county that's actually trending pretty blue pretty quickly. This was a county that Bush in 2000 won by 30 plus points, and now, Republicans are only winning it by 14, 15 points. And, Dr. Oz back in 2022, I think only won Lancaster by, 12. So, there's sort of a dire situation in Pennsylvania where Republicans are sort of running out of ground in these high population Republican strongholds like Lancaster. They're losing ground in them. Chester County also used to be a red county, and now it's a safe Democratic county. So Republicans are losing ground in suburban and exurban counties. And, you know, while they're growing in rural counties, it's certainly not enough because these rural counties have much smaller populations than obviously big, dense urban counties and suburban counties where the Republicans have really fallen off. So, you know, again, this race, as I've specified before, likely Democratic. I think we're going to come back to it a few times before the election. I think it's really a question of how close Dave McCormick can get, because if Donald Trump and Dave McCormick don't do that bad in the state of Pennsylvania, you know, potentially you could see Republican pickups in the House, even though I think at this point it's very unlikely Republicans hold on to the House with the way the maps are drawn right now, because Republicans really missed all their opportunities to win these toss-up districts back in 2022. And of course, this time around, now they're going up against Democratic incumbents. That already gives them a little bit of advantage. And, you know, Joe Biden is not polling that bad when it comes to head-to-head polls with Donald Trump. He's only down by around a point nationally. And, you know, in states like Pennsylvania, he's actually ahead. So with Biden being ahead in Pennsylvania, it provides huge headwinds for somebody like Dave McCormick or even other statewide Republicans to win the state. Now, of course, I want to make a separate video on Pennsylvania to talk about the pretty dire situation Republicans are in for long term, because I think a lot of the gains and the trends they could have expounded upon after 2016, they really failed to resonate. You know, they flipped Luzerne County, but Luzerne County is a county of 320,000 people that's shrinking by the day. And they're losing ground in places like Chester County, places that are growing, have around 600,000 people, and they're getting a lot bluer. So Republicans really made a pretty bad trade-off, I think, in the state, because if you wanted to win Pennsylvania, ideally, you would be getting close in Chester County and still maybe narrowly winning or narrowly losing places like Luzerne County. So it seems like Republicans got caught in a very narrow window during a realignment period. And it seems like now they sort of missed the stop, and now you have these suburban areas trending left off a cliff, and the rural areas are pretty much stagnant. So Pennsylvania is already a difficult enough state to win, but it is sort of the key to the White House in a sense. I really think Wisconsin is more of the tipping point rather than Pennsylvania, because I'm sort of assuming Pennsylvania goes Democratic this time around anyway. And while I still have Wisconsin narrowly going to Joe Biden, it's much more of a true toss-up than I think Pennsylvania is. Pennsylvania is definitely a leaning Democratic state. So, you know, going into November, you know, Bob Casey's definitely going to have his toughest re-election yet. That being said, his closest election yet was around 9 points. So, you know, perhaps something like that is sort of a duh statement because, you know, obviously in a presidential year where Donald Trump's on the ballot, you're probably not going to see split ticket voting enough to get Bob Casey 8 or 9 points ahead of Dave McCormick. So, you know, we'll obviously keep tabs on this race as it goes on, but, you know, it's certainly going to be a monumental task to take down Bob Casey. But of course, if other options like Arizona, Nevada aren't working out for the GOP, you know, perhaps it does make sense to put your resources in Pennsylvania with a candidate who probably is the best candidate to go up against Bob Casey so far. But obviously, only time will tell when it comes to that. Anyway, that's it for today's video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos I put out. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.